Hi, my name is Roland and welcome to my VectrexRoli show. Thanks for joining me again, and this video here is a Commodore Amiga 500 special. That Amiga 500 was a very successful home computer in the late 1980s and early 90s, especially here in the German-speaking region. There were several models and incarnations of Amiga computers available, but this video would get too long if I would mention all of them now, so I will focus only on the 500 model here. I will not cover the whole Amiga history. I don't know everything about Amiga computers, but I cannot even cover all the things I do know, as this would be a boring video then several hours long. What I want to do instead is that I would like to show you my current Amiga 500 setup. I will tell you why I prefer the Amiga 500 Plus. I will mention how I do retrobrighting. I will show you my Stefanie Tücking limited edition Amiga, and finally I will also show you the new ACA 500 Plus add-on, and I will also tell you how I set up the Amiga operating system on it. I cannot go into all the details, so please don't expect any tutorials now, but maybe that video will inspire some people that are thinking about getting such a computer, or maybe you just want to know more about that machine. I will also share my experiences and learnings on my way to the perfect Amiga 500 setup I always wanted. I currently have 3 different types of Amiga computers in my collection. Why do I start with the Amiga 500 now? Well, I got one back in the days after my TR99 4A and my Sinclair ZX Spectrum, so I feel a lot of nostalgia for that machine. The Amiga 500 is also quite interesting, as you still can get it for a reasonable amount of money. Other types of Amigas got very expensive over the years, unfortunately. By the way, I did already show some of my other home computers on video, so go and check that out if you have not seen that. I always try to share my own experiences, and I'm not just reading Wikipedia articles to my viewers here. What you see here is one of my 2 fully working Amiga 500 models I currently own. The Amiga 500 was released in 1987 after the Amiga 1000, and the 500 was the first affordable mass-market Amiga version. This is an European PAL machine. The Amiga 500 came with an external power supply, and you also can use an Amiga 1200 power brick. There are a few Amiga power supplies out there that can deliver 5 volts with 4.5 ampere instead of the usual 3 ampere. I got one of those recently. It is still yellow, so I did not have time to retrobright it. Totally can recommend that if you use many expansions, especially old classic hard disks or turbo cards, as they might consume more power. The 500 came with a proper keyboard, a built-in 3.5-inch floppy disk drive, and you could connect a RGB monitor, a mouse, a joystick. You get Cinch or RCA stereo audio output, a parallel and serial interface, and you can connect external hardware like hard disks or turbo cards to the expansion port. You also could buy a RF modulator with composite video out, but video quality was not as good as with RGB, of course. In Europe, many TVs had SCART connector for RGB signals back then, so that was the way to go. Or you could also buy Commodore branded monitors, which were rebranded Philips video monitors in most cases, at least here in Europe. The older Amiga models came with a built-in Motorola 68000 processor running at about 7 MHz. My version here is the later 500 Plus model. As you can see on the label, this is the version with motherboard revision 8A. Commodore bought the whole concept for Amiga computers from an external company. I guess they would have never been able to develop something like that themselves, and that company, called the Amiga Corporation, also produced other things like joysticks before they were bought by Commodore. But now let's watch some graphic demo, and I will tell you what was so fascinating with the Amiga back then. Graphic demos like you see here were a big thing on the Amiga back then. Many people had the feeling that the Amiga was way ahead of its time. With an Amiga computer you got excellent graphic capabilities and excellent sound, you got a multitasking operating system so you could run several programs in parallel, which was a new thing for a home computer back then. Most other computers, especially PCs or 8-bit home computers, did look like Stone Age tools compared to the Amiga, so the Amiga was the future. There were a few machines that came close, like the Atari ST for example. The early ST versions were an excellent choice if you wanted to work with your computer and wanted to do things like desktop publishing or connecting your MIDI music instruments to your computer, as you could buy a paper-white monitor for it, which could show high-resolution black and white graphics and was flicker-free, at least for 1980 standards. You could also play color games that came close to Amiga games, but if graphic capabilities, games and nice looking video titles were your thing, you definitely wanted to get an Amiga back then. The whole Commodore Amiga story did end in the 1990s. I have the feeling that one of the main reasons was lack of proper product management, and also many bad management decisions were made by Commodore, so they filed for bankruptcy in 1994, but there are still companies even today using the Commodore brand name or the Amiga logos. Back in the 1990s, PC hardware was getting cheaper, so you could buy quite powerful VGA graphic cards for a low amount of money, and even the whole PC operating system from Microsoft still looked like something from the Stone Age. You could get nice looking games using cheap, powerful PC hardware. Talking about games, one important reason why so many people wanted an Amiga back then were the excellent games. When you bought a game for a home computer, like for the Sinclair Spectrum or C64, the screenshots on the back of the box showed the Amiga version in most cases, which was usually the best looking reference version. Games came on floppy disks, and with proper software it was easy to copy those, even in case they were copy protected, so piracy was a big thing back then. If you are one of my younger viewers, let me tell you that most classic Amiga games were 2D games, some were isometric 3D titles, there were a few titles with real 3D graphics, but usually you didn't get any textures on the 3D objects with most classic games, so those games look outdated when you compare it to later PlayStation 1 titles for example. Still, in case you would like to try some of the nice Amiga retro game titles, there are great emulators out there, so you don't need to buy an Amiga just for that. Today you even can get FPGA computers that are capable of simulating the Amiga 500 hardware. But you know what? When you had an Amiga back then and you feel some nostalgia for it, all those emulators and FPGA simulators don't feel right and they don't smell like a real Amiga, and in that case all you want is a real Amiga. Now I would like to mention the custom chipsets of the Amiga that were responsible for the graphic and sound capabilities of that computer. There were 3 generations of them: the original chipset or OCS, which you can find in older versions of the Amiga 500, then there was the slightly improved enhanced chipset or ECS, which you can find in later Amiga 500 Plus models, and finally there was the advanced graphics architecture or AGA, which you can find in more modern models like the Amiga 1200 or Amiga 4000. Most classic games worked with the old OCS, there were a few games that use ECS, and there were some AGA games with nicer looking graphics. The reason I tell you that is that you know what to expect when buying an Amiga 500. You can run most classic games and programs. If you want to use AGA graphics, you need something like an Amiga 1200, or there might be some trick available in the future using an upgraded Vampire card in Amiga 500 or something like that. If you are not sure what you really want, you might think about getting an Amiga 1200, as this is the better and more powerful machine and you have more possibilities there, but unfortunately they got quite expensive over time. If I see that my subscribers are interested in my Amiga video here, I might show you also my current Amiga 1200 setup in a future video. There I use AmiKit Real and also add-ons like a Wi-Fi card and the MP3 player add-on. But back to the Amiga 500 now, and let's dive a bit deeper into the whole technology. I can only go to a certain level here and cannot tell you everything, as this video would get too long and boring. What you see here is a classic Amiga 500 motherboard I'm currently not using, as I was more interested in an Amiga 500 Plus setup. One advantage of classic Amiga 500 motherboards is that they don't have any deadly electrolytic capacitors on board. On more modern models like the 1200 or 4000 for example, there are always leaking SMD capacitors that will destroy the traces on your PCB if you don't replace them in time. I've not seen that so far with classic Amiga 500s. Of course, it does not hurt replacing also those at some point, but in most cases it is not urgently needed right now. The external Amiga 500 power supplies are a different story. There were lots of different models and variations delivered together with the computers, so quality may vary there. The Amiga 500 Plus is slightly different. The capacitors are also fine in most cases, but in Amiga 500 Plus models there is another self-destruct mechanism built in form of a rechargeable clock battery, but I will come to that later. Here we see the Motorola 68000 CPU. This is a so-called CISC processor, and CISC stands for Complex Instruction Set Computer. Such types of processors were optimized to make programming more comfortable. You could program very powerful and complex processing steps using one single instruction, but the downside was that it was more complicated and expensive to build those CISC processors. Therefore later so-called RISC CPUs were used instead, and RISC stands for Reduced Instruction Set Computer. There you don't have many powerful instructions, but only a few less complex instructions, which makes the CPU much faster and also easier to build. The last official Motorola processor from the 68K series was the 68060, which is the CPU I use in my Amiga 4000 computer currently. But enough of that. More important now, let's have a look at the Amiga chipset. Up there is Denise, responsible for graphics output, then we have Polar, responsible for audio output and other stuff like floppy disk drives, and then we have Agnes, which is in overall control of the entire chipset's operation, including access to the built-in RAM, known as chip RAM. Why do I tell you all of that? Well, the whole chip RAM story is one of the reasons why I wanted a newer Amiga 500 Plus model for my setup, so all the special chips like video and audio and also together with the 68000 CPU can access the common chip RAM, and they can get, for example, graphics and sound data from there. An old classic OCS Amiga 500 can have 512 kilobytes up to 1 megabyte of chip RAM, depending on your version of the Agnes chip available on the board. That's enough for most classic original Amiga games, but still certain newer games and demos need 2 megabytes of chip RAM, which you will get when using a later more modern Amiga 500 Plus, together with a 1 megabyte memory expansion, so you can do a few things more with an Amiga 500 Plus than with a classic Amiga 500, as it has the more modern enhanced chipset ECS built in. In most Plus models there's also a more modern version of the Denise graphic chip built in, which can show a few more graphic modes, which you really only need if you're called VectrexRoli and you are a retro computer snob, or also in case you are a hardcore Amiga 500 fan. As I did already mention chip RAM, let me also mention the other Amiga RAM types. There is the so-called fast RAM. You find on special RAM expansions and turbo cards. There only the CPU has access to the RAM and not all the other special Amiga chips, which makes access for the CPU faster. And there is also the so-called slow RAM. This is usually a memory area, the trapdoor expansion of the Amiga 500, which is slow like chip RAM. Even the video and audio chips cannot access any data there directly in the slow RAM area, so with slow RAM you have the disadvantages of chip RAM without any advantages other than such memory expansions are cheap and easy to build, and you can get some more RAM for your old classic Amiga 500 without paying a fortune. So I hope I did not confuse you too much with all of that. The most important thing to remember for now is that the Amiga 500 Plus can do a few things more than classic Amiga 500 versions. The only question here is if you really need those additional features and if it's worth paying a bit more for a 500 Plus model. Well, the answer to that question really depends mainly on how you want to launch your Amiga games, so let's go into that topic next. What you see here is the so-called Kickstart ROM. When you switch on your Amiga, the software in that ROM starts up, and you can then boot from a floppy disk or also a hard disk or compact flash drive. So Amiga OS consists of both the Kickstart firmware or BIOS on ROM and the software component provided on disk, and that could be a graphical user interface which is called Workbench, and that Workbench version has to match the Kickstart version on ROM. In case you have no hard disk, you get a screen showing that you should insert a floppy disk now. Back then most games came in floppy disk or several disks, and in most cases they would boot directly into the game, so most games you would not install on hard disk, as most people didn't even own any hard disk back then. So if you still own many classic original games or copies on floppy disk, you simply put them into the floppy disk drive and there you go. The only thing you need to take care of is that you got a compatible Kickstart version on your ROM that will work with your games. For old games that's usually Kickstart version 1.3 or even 1.2. Some people even use special add-ons to switch between different Kickstart versions. So you use your Amiga just like a gaming console, and there are neither hard disks nor compact flash drives involved. Of course, floppy disks will die over time, so you can replace your floppy drive with a modern USB or SD card based floppy simulator. Only difference is that you can launch a special file menu and start the disk image from there. I cannot show you that as I don't really use anything like that on my setup here, but YouTube is full of such videos. In that case I just described an old classic Amiga 500 with an old Kickstart version like 1.3 will be the much better and more compatible solution than an Amiga 500 Plus. The classic Amiga 500 is also cheap in most cases, and you will have so much fun also with the standard classic one. Now let's come to my preferred setup. The way I prefer to launch my Amiga 500 programs is that I use some kind of hard disk replacement in form of a compact flash drive, where the Amiga operating system is installed together with games and demos. So I don't want to deal with floppy disks or floppy simulators anymore. Even I could still also boot from the floppy drive if I really want. For games and demos I use something called WHD load. This is basically a software tool which allows you to run your Amiga software, which is dependent usually on specific OS and Kickstart versions, on your current OS environment. With other words, I can take an old game written for Kickstart 1.2 and can run it on a more modern 3.1 Amiga operating system environment, for example. So I don't need to think about booting up with an old Kickstart version first. I can boot a more modern OS and start the game from hard disk or compact flash card. So that's the method I prefer on all of my Amiga computers. You might need some kind of turbo card and a RAM expansion if you want to use all WHD load features, but it does not have to be an expensive high performance model. I will tell you more about the flash drive solution I use later, which is the ACA500 Plus from individual computers. You know, there are really tons of options how you can set up your Amiga. Some people even put the motherboard in a tower case and go from there and expand that. If you want to see something like that, I can recommend to watch Glen's retro show, and I will link to his video. What he's doing is a completely different approach to what I do here, but it shows you some of the possibilities you have, and you might like such a tower setup more. Check out his channel, by the way, you will find a lot of really helpful and interesting stuff there. And if you also like his channel as much as I do, go and subscribe to his show. Next, a few words about the mouse controller for the Amiga 500. I use a modern replacement mouse which works on all of my classic Amiga models, but there are also other options available, like using an adapter. The original mouse was the so-called Amiga tank model. Like most models back then, it had a ball mechanism, but if you still want to use your old classic tank mouse, there is an upgrade PCB available to convert it into a modern laser mouse. I currently own two Amiga 500 Plus models. This is the standard beige version in original Plus case. It also says 500 Plus on the label. The motherboard's cases, keyboards and floppy drives are fully compatible between classic 500 and Plus versions, so you can put also a Plus motherboard in a standard classic case if you want. The 500 Plus is more expensive and hard to find if you want to buy the German version, so I bought mine from the UK and put a German keyboard in, as I don't want to look for those special characters I need for config file changes, so I want the same key layout as on all of my other computers. When you buy a classic 500 case, keep in mind that people put all kind of switches in back in the days, to switch off the memory expansion for example, so make sure you don't get a case with lots of holes in it. You don't need such switches anymore when using a modern flash drive setup. So I did already tell you why I prefer 500 Plus. Now let's come to the biggest problem when buying one. Basically, you should only buy one from a seller who can show you a photo of the PCB from the area where the rechargeable clock battery was built in. The Plus had one directly on the PCB, and that rechargeable buffer battery usually was leaking acid after some time, which did destroy then some of the traces on the PCB. So I guess if that battery was not replaced already years ago, you definitely should not buy the computer or motherboard without having a look how those traces look like. I put a battery clip there instead, so you can replace the rechargeable battery with something else if you want. I got a set from eBay with a battery, a clip and a diode, and it is simple to solder that in if you still want to use the clock on the PCB. Another option would be to get an external clock module, like the one for the ACE 500 Plus expansion, if you want to use that on your Amiga. It is much easier to replace the battery then. Anyway, to sum that up, the original rechargeable battery on your Plus motherboard needs to be removed, or it should have been removed already years ago. You should really have a look at that when buying a 500 Plus. It can get extremely complicated or even impossible to fix any damaged traces on the PCB. But as I already said, you can have tons of fun also with standard classic 500 models if you don't want to go through all of that. I would like to use my 500 Plus here together with a so-called Vampire card at some point, which is a turbo card with lots of additional features, but instead of using an old classic Motorola CPU, the developers of the Vampire designed a new one on FPGA, which is compatible to Motorola CPUs but much faster than any classic Motorola 68K based CPU available before. You know, some Amiga owners wanted more than just using old classic hardware, they want new and faster Amigas, so today you can get such new computers called Amiga NG. NG stands for next generation, but those computers are super expensive and based on expensive PowerPC CPUs in most cases, so that's different with the Vampire now. Thanks to FPGA technology, you are not dependent on old stock 68K CPUs or expensive PowerPC stuff. You still can use your old classic Amiga hardware and classic old operating systems and most of your software with a much faster, modern and compatible CPU. I guess the Vampire could open up a new area for people that want something slightly similar to a new Amiga and G computer. I'm pretty sure that still more people are interested in classic Amiga hardware than buying an expensive modern PowerPC thing with some kind of Amiga logo on it. But it also depends on how you define Amiga for yourself, or what it really is that makes an Amiga a real Amiga computer for you. I put my name on an order list for the Vampire card, but currently it can take many months until you can get one, which is the biggest downside of the thing at the moment. Still, I already prepared an Amiga 500 Plus for that, as I was worried that Amiga prices will go up when more people will find out about the Vampire for the Amiga 500. Some people say that the Vampire is based on emulation, which is not the case, and it is beyond me why anyone would think that. Anyway, should I ever get old enough to receive my Vampire one day, I might show it on video, but let me talk a bit about retrobrighting now. I guess most of you will already know what retrobrighting is. Basically, you use some chemical stuff together with UV light to make the plastic on your white or grey computers or toys or gaming consoles look like new again. Plastic material can get yellow over the years, and you can have the same issue with your Amiga equipment. Many people think that yellowing only happens when you had your computer in the sun for a long time, because it was standing beside a window, for example, but I can tell you there are also other reasons. I have seen it happening with home computers stored in boxes without any light. I'm not an expert, but I guess maybe also oxygen could play an important role here. Anyway, you can get a nice new look back again in many cases, but according to the current theory today in 2017, the yellow color will come back after a few months or years. So you should be aware of that. If you see a nice looking white case on eBay, the previous owner might have just done some retrobrighting before selling it. If you want a solution that lasts very long, you either could try to paint your case, or you could try to get a modern replacement repro case from some Kickstarter campaign, for example. Still, I did retrobright all my Amiga computers, including also the keys from the keyboard and disk eject buttons. As far as I remember, Amiga 500s were always more beige than white originally, which is different for other Amiga models. I quickly want to show you what I use for retrobrighting, what worked best for me. It is quite easy to do with Amigas, only with some colorful logos like on an Amiga 4000, you need to be careful and you might want to cover that with tape. I've seen people mixing super complicated retrobrighting recipes, but just forget that. Go and buy something like this one here. I always order this cream peroxide 12% 40 volume for hair bleaching. You can get this from England for a few bucks, for example. You should not use a higher percentage than 12%, that is more than enough. I will not show you the whole process. I will not play around with cream peroxide when using my camera equipment, but it is not rocket science anyway. Clean the plastic first with some water, let it dry, then put that cream on your Amiga using a brush, then wrap some plastic foil around it so that it does not dry out. You should use protection gloves or wash your hands immediately after using cream peroxide. If you want a nice looking keyboard, remove all the keycaps from the keyboard and put them in an airtight bag, fill some of the cream in the bag and you're ready to go. You can put that now into the sun for 1 or 2 hours, depending where you live, but I wanted to do that during winter here in Central Europe, so I bought this UV lamp and absolutely can recommend that. This is the Osram Ultra Vitalux 300 watts, 230 volts for an E27 lamp socket. I don't know if there is also a 100 to 120 volts version available. That lamp is perfect. The light is similar to what you get on a nice sunny day on a high mountain. When you switch on the lamp, it does take a few minutes until the light from the lamp reaches the full spectrum, and keep in mind that light spectrum also will change when the lamp gets older, so I would buy a new one instead of an old used one. You also need a socket that can handle a hot lamp and 300 watts. And if you use also a switch, keep in mind that not all cheap power switches out there will survive 300 watts. That lamp gets hot, so take care when in use, also lock it away from kids or pets. You can get a sunburn and might get even blind after some time, and you also should not move the lamp around when it is hot. I built this tower of light for my retrobrighting work with some reflecting aluminium foil at the bottom, and I'm very happy with the results I'm getting. Keep in mind, some people are saying that retrobrighting is weakening the plastic, don't really know if this is true, and the yellow color might come back eventually, so it is up to you if you really want to use retrobrighting at all. In case you want to do retrobrighting, don't waste your money buying one of those UVA spectrum cold lights. I bought it because some people were recommending those. They don't show any effect when using the 12% cream, even when running for days. I'm sure they are missing some important parts of the UV spectrum, and taking cream peroxide with a higher percentage is not an option in my opinion. So those kind of lamps are great if you want to build your own disco in your basement or for your next Halloween party, but not really for retrobrighting according to my experience. Okay, enough of that. Now you know why I prefer an Amiga 500 Plus. Even also the older classic 500 models are great. You know what to take care of when buying a 500 Plus, and you know that I use WHD load with a flash drive to launch the classic Amiga games, and you also know how I do retrobrighting. Next, I would like to show you my current Amiga 500 setup. This is a 500 Plus motherboard together with a German keyboard in a wonderful cheesy looking classic Amiga 500 Stefanie Tücking case. The whole thing is expanded with an additional Indivision ECS flicker fixer and connected to an ACA 500 Plus with a turbo card. But let's have a closer look at all those things now. First, let's come to that Stefanie Tücking case. I do remember seeing that case design in German Amiga magazines back in the days, so when I saw this on eBay I had to have it. Those were limited editions classic Amiga 500s from 1989. Those were not Amiga Plus models, even I put the Plus motherboard in now. There were two designs available, and I think there were 10,000 computers produced in each design. There was also some kind of leopard design available, which does not look that great in my personal opinion. I prefer that nice and cheesy and 1980s look of my Amiga case here. It is only the upper side of the case that has some special design. All the rest is just a beige standard 500 case with a standard keyboard. The upper part with the design does not get yellow, so as long as you don't scratch it, it always looks nice without any retrobrighting. And as it is white, the keyboard and all the beige colored rest appears to be much darker than it looks on standard Amigas. There is even a signature of Stefanie Tücking on the case as part of the design. Who is Mrs. Tücking, you might ask? Well, I had to look that up on Wikipedia myself, and she's a German actress, writer, TV presenter, and she's also doing radio shows. She was, and probably still is, big in Germany from what I can tell, otherwise Commodore would not have asked her to design Amiga cases. She was even a rally co-driver once, so Mrs. Tücking seems to live quite an adventurous and happy life, and I found one of her TV shows from 1987 called Formel Eins on YouTube, and I will link to that. Even you don't understand German language, you might enjoy all those 1980s music video snippets you can watch there. But it's the inner values that count. So as I said, there is a Plus motherboard built in, the original battery was removed and replaced with a battery clip, and I built in an Indivision ECS flicker fixer. You get then also a VGA signal and a VGA connector for graphic output, but you still can use also the standard RGB output in parallel. I did a flash update on the Indivision to the latest beta version of the core, version 1.10, as I wanted to use more colors on my workbench screen than it would be possible with a standard Amiga 500, but that did not work on my setup unfortunately, as the necessary Super Plus monitor driver does crash when booting up. Don't know what's the deal with that. If you want, you can even stack two Indivision ECS modules on top of each other and connect even two VGA screens, but I did not try that. If you want to put the VGA socket in your Amiga case, you can buy a separate longer monitor connector cable from Amiga Kit for example, or build one yourself. The cable that comes with the Indivision is too short to put the connector on the right back side of the case, beside the mouse and joystick ports, where I guess it would be the best place to put them. I used a different approach, where I put the VGA connector in the same case as my ACA 500 Plus, so still I could use the short cable that did come with my Indivision. I also put heatsinks on the special chips, Agnes, Paula and Denise, not really urgently required, but it keeps them cool for the upcoming years and hopefully they will live a bit longer then. As always on my Amiga computers, I replaced the Kickstart ROM with a more modern Cloanto 3.x version, which is basically an enhanced 3.1 Kickstart ROM, and you get a few advantages then, that you can boot from a larger hard disk for example. You don't have to do that, there are also other solutions available, but that ROM is not really that expensive. If you also want to use one, take care to get the latest version of the Cloanto 3.x ROM, which was 45.064 at the time I made this video, as previous versions had a bug and then your floppy disk drive would not work in some setups. I still can also put the metal shielding back on top of the motherboard, even with the Indivision and the heatsinks. Also this is not really required, but before I have to store it separately somewhere, it can be also in the computer then. Next we will have a look at the new ACA 500 Plus add-on from Individual Computers I'm using on my Stefanie Tücking enhanced Amiga 500 Plus here. Please don't expect a detailed review, and I cannot tell you about all the features, as this video would be 1 hour longer then, and there are already many videos on YouTube showing that device in detail. As I said, I only want to share my learnings and experiences with my setup here. The ACA 500 Plus is the second iteration of that product. A few years ago you could get an ACA 500, that one was quite nice, but it had a few design flaws, so if you want an ACA 500 you should better take the newer Plus model instead of buying an old used one, unless you get it cheap and you know what you're doing. The ACA 500 Plus is an external add-on, so you don't put it into the machine like the Vampire card or many other turbo cards, and as the Amiga 500 takes a lot of desk space already, it gets worse now with the external ACA 500, but it can also be an advantage for people that are worried to open up their Amiga. You just need to plug it in and you're ready to go. That add-on costs around €130 plus shipping, and you also need to buy compact flash cards for it, and what you get for your money is some kind of Swiss Army knife for your Amiga with lots of interesting features. You know, first I thought I will skip this product and only will buy a new Vampire card, but when I saw what you can do with it, I found it pretty cool. Often people compare this to the Vampire, but keep in mind the ACA 500 Plus serves a different purpose. While the Vampire card is more a product for hardcore Amiga fans that wants to push their computer to its limits, this here is more suitable for people that prefer a classic setup or just found their old Amiga 500 in the loft. Maybe the disk drive is not working anymore, but still they want to play some classic games, and for this the ACA 500 Plus is just perfect. You get an own 68K CPU on board, which you can overclock, you get 8MB of RAM, 2 compact flash card slots, one acting as an Amiga hard disk, the other one to exchange data with your PC. You also get an Action Replay compatible freezer, which I never really used so far, and in case you already have also a memory expansion inside your Amiga 500, you can continue to use that in most cases. You can boot up using Kickstart versions 1.2, 1.3, 3.1. They are all already licensed and built in, or you can boot up with your Kickstart ROM you have on your motherboard. That thing has many interesting features. I cannot tell you about all of them here now. You can install and use WHD load games on your compact flash drive, for example. If you are using a standard classic non-plus Amiga with board revision 6 or higher, which has already an ECS Agnes chip on board and an internal 512K memory expansion, you can turn your computer into a 1MB chip RAM computer just by selecting a menu item in the configuration menu, so that's really cool. You can also connect a few Amiga 1200 turbo cards to your ACA 500 Plus in case you want more speed or RAM, but as used cards can quite expensive nowadays, also the new ones from individual computers do cost quite some money. You can get the ACA 1221 EC, which is a 25 MHz 68020 card, and this one costs €120 plus shipping, and I even expanded my ACA 500 Plus with a ACA 1233N40, which is a 40 MHz 68030 card with 128 MB of RAM, but this one is already quite pricey with €240 plus shipping. Those are excellent turbo cards based on old classic Motorola CPUs, but you have to decide for yourself if it might be a better idea to get just a standalone ACA 500 Plus or the new Vampire card instead. I personally don't regret that I bought also the ACA 1233N. There are only two things I don't like. First, some WHD load games don't work with it, and yes, I did try the latest version of WHD load, and yes, I know that you can change the configuration, and I got most of the games running by doing that. I still cannot launch a few games like Seawolf with my turbo card, for example, and I still need to ask in some forum if there's some trick for that. But that issue with WHD load is something you might also experience with turbo cards from other vendors, and when I deactivate the ACA 1233N, I can launch Seawolf by just using the CPU on the ACA 500 Plus. The second thing I don't like is that if you want to use a floating point unit on your 68030 card, you have to add a socket for that yourself on the PCB, and you lose warranty then. You don't need that for games, and you don't need it for 99.9% of the Amiga software library. Still, if I pay €240 for a turbo card, I would like to be able to use all the bells and whistles. I did not find much documentation how to add the coprocessor, so I just bought a 50 MHz 68882 from China, a socket, and also a 50 MHz crystal oscillator. I put all of that on the PCB, and it seems to work fine with all the test software used so far. Anyway, I also put heatsinks on the CPU and the coprocessor, again not really urgently required as they don't get super hot. Still, maybe those chips will live a bit longer then. The only downside is that you don't see that nice golden look of the classic Motorola processors anymore. I also put an optional clock module on my turbo card, as it is much easier to replace the battery there than opening up my Amiga 500 Plus. Next, let's have a quick look at the acrylic glass or plexiglass case. I really like that. It is just perfect for my ACA 500 Plus setup with the turbo card and with the VGA connector for my Indivision ECS. Due to that VGA cable, it is very complicated to disconnect my ACA 500 Plus anymore, so I always leave it on my Stefanie Tücking Amiga, but thanks to that solution I did not need to drill a hole in the back of my Amiga for the VGA connector. In case you use an additional turbo card, you will get some high frequency noise on your VGA picture signal, so take care that the cable is not touching the turbo card. Try to put it away from it as far as possible. That case was designed by some smart guy from the German A1K Amiga forum. You can order the case in kit form from a German web store. I will put the link for that below. Unfortunately, their web shop is in German language only, and also the manual that comes with the kit is in German only. I don't know if they ship also worldwide, but you always can drop them a message and ask. That case is perfect if you put also a turbo card on your AC500 Plus. There are even openings for heat ventilation, and you still can access the button for the freezer functionality. Only downside is that over time some dust will come in there. If you don't use any turbo card, the case will look a bit empty, and you should also know that Jens Schönfeld from Individual Computers, the maker of the AC500 Plus, he mentioned there might not be enough space in that case for all the upcoming add-ons he's planning. But I don't know what it should be, maybe a USB port or a network card. Not sure if I would really need that on my Amiga 500, as I also own an Amiga 1200 and 4000, but anyway, just that you are aware of that. But I think the case as it is now, it is still better than just having the card hanging out of your Amiga. The last topic I want to talk about is installation of the Amiga operating system on your compact flash card. I want to give you some hints here, but there is no time for a detailed tutorial or anything like that. On the AC500 Plus you even get the contents of OS 3.1 floppy disks pre-installed, so you can install a complete Amiga operating system on your compact flash card without any floppy disks or without using an Amiga emulator. This is helpful for a quick and easy start, but if you want to do more, I can recommend to learn how to use the Amiga emulator WinUAE on your PC, and the idea is then that you prepare everything on your PC first, so you prepare everything on your compact flash card, and then use that one on your AC500 Plus later. For Amiga compact flash drives I always use this Transcend brand here. That specific model works on Amiga 1200 and 4000 computers, and they also work with my AC500 Plus. There are some faster models available, but someone on Amazon was saying that those did not work on his Amiga 1200. Don't know if that's true, but because of that I never bought any other version than the one you see here. What size of compact flash card do you need? Some people say that 2GB is enough, some say 4GB. 4GB usually work on most Amigas without having a special Kickstart ROM version or using other tricks. On my Amiga 1200 setup I currently use 16GB, on my Amiga 500 I use 8GB. Then you need a PC with the WinUAE emulator, together with the necessary OS disk images and Kickstart ROMs. There are several ways to get that. One legal way is that you buy that Amiga Forever package. Then you need also compact flash cards that work on your AC500 Plus and a compact flash card reader for your PC. Next you go to an excellent web blog, I will leave a link for that below. There you will learn how to format your compact flash card on your PC with a more modern and faster Amiga file system called PFS3. PFS stands for Professional File System, and I always use that one instead of the old classic fast file system. When you learned how to do all of that and it is working for you, I recommend that you go to the excellent classic Workbench webpage next to download a Workbench package suitable for your hardware. You get a nice looking system with the most important software pre-installed. Also WHD load is included, but you might need to update some of the programs to the latest versions. Check out the detailed hardware requirements first to choose which package you want to use. Then you can install everything using the emulator on your PC first, and you need Workbench floppy images for that, like the ones you find on the Amiga Forever package for example. On my Amiga 500 I currently use the so-called Classic Workbench Full package, which was intended to be used on Amiga 1200 setups, but it works fine as I use a turbo card with enough memory. So is this now my perfect Amiga 500 setup I always wanted? Well, yes, I would think so. An Amiga 500 Plus with the AC500 Plus is the perfect classic Amiga setup. Even my Indivision ECS cannot show some of the special graphic modes, or even I cannot play all WHD load games with my turbo card now, but you know, that was always part of the whole Amiga hobby, that you try to improve and optimize certain configuration settings. I can play most classic games, some classic 3D titles work better with the turbo card, so I really enjoy that. Should I ever get my vampire card for the Amiga 500, that will also be a quite interesting experience, but that might be a completely different story than this classic setup here. So I hope you did enjoy this long video, and I hope you did learn a few things that might be helpful for you. And if you say now, but Roland, why did you not show us all the great new Amiga homebrew games? There is no time for that, unfortunately, but you know, I have a much better idea if you want to watch that. I will link to a channel called The Guru Meditation. Go there and subscribe to that channel. You will see two entertaining gentlemen that do even Amiga related live streams. I really enjoy the show and can recommend that. I will also leave a list of links in the description text below to some Amiga related YouTube channels and podcasts, both in English and German language, so go and check that out. You know, making videos is a lot of work and very time consuming, and as this is a non-commercial hobby activity, this is a free service for you, so please consider subscribing to my channel to show your support. You will find a lot of stuff here you have not seen on a million other YouTube channels before. Please like, share and feel free to leave a comment, and as always, thanks for watching.